Greetings, welcome. I'm Susan Barnett, the Margaret and Dick Scarlett Curator of Western Art for the Whitney Western Art Museum. Thank you for joining us for a special Peter Hassrick public program in conjunction with the exhibition that's currently in the John Booker Sands Gallery called James Bama's Photographs, Portraits of the West. Peter Hassrick was one of America's foremost scholar authors on Western American art. The Peter Hassrick Public Program Series perpetuates his passion for innovative and creative public programming through the Whitney Western Art Museum. Our presenter this evening is Thomas Brent Smith. Like the Center's Executive Director, Rebecca West, Thomas arrived at the Center of the West as an intern for the Whitney Western Art Museum many years ago. He returned to research his master's thesis on James Bama, and again for a research residency with the McCracken Research Library. Thomas spent many hours with Jim and his family and recorded 5 interviews, and he became a close friend as well as an expert on Bama's work. Our digital guide in the exhibition features many excerpts from these interviews, and there's some really wonderful tidbits. It's great to hear James Bama speaking in his own voice about his art, so thank you for providing that resource. Thomas Brent Smith is the Wylodian and Bill Saxon Director of the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art at the University of Oklahoma. Previously, he spent 13 years as director of the Petrie Institute of Western American Art at the Denver Art Museum, and he was mentored by Peter Hassrick, so it's really nice to bring him back for this Peter Hassrick program. Tonight's presentation is titled James Bama's Photographs, an Essential Tool. Please help me in welcoming Thomas Brent Smith.
Thank you, Susan. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm grateful to Susan for the invitation, and would like to begin by commending her and also Ashley for the work that they did with the exhibition. It's really fantastic, and also the catalog. 3 years ago, when I took over as director of the museum at the university, I committed and vowed to myself that I wasn't going to do these things anymore, and that would be the end of research and writing and scholarly things, that I was just going to be a museum administrator. So when Susan emailed, I really hesitated at first, and then of course my better senses got to me, and I said, I can't not do this. I really have to. And it has been a wonderful experience being back here in Cody, and also to spend time going back to things that I haven't thought about in quite a long time. I am also very honored to participate in the Peter Hassrick Public Program Series. As Susan mentioned, Peter Hassrick was very much a mentor to me, and still remains the biggest influence on my professional career. So I'm very honored to participate in that. He was my predecessor at the Denver Art Museum, and we had the opportunity to spend several years together. And I learned a tremendous amount from Peter Hassrick, and it's wonderful to see this public program series really carry on in his honor. And I think it's just, it's the most wonderful thing, because he was someone who was very dedicated to public programs. Being back in Cody and speaking about James Bama is certainly a full circle moment for me in many ways. I came to Cody for the first time almost 20 years ago, which is really hard for me to believe. And in fact, it wasn't until I started putting this presentation together that I realized it had been 20 years. And I can't believe that that's the case. It just is really amazing. I first came here to work in the Whitney Gallery and work on an exhibition about William Ranney. Some of you who were here back many, many years ago might have remembered that show. But it certainly didn't take long until I met Jim Bama. And by the next summer, or before that, my first summer, we had already made plans for me to come back the very next summer, and that I would start working with Jim during that time. Ultimately, I came back a third summer and stayed for quite some time after my graduate work, working on this project up until the time that I left Cody to become curator at the Tucson Museum of Art. And altogether, I was here about a year, about 12 months, although luckily I missed all winters and springs. I just took the very best of it and was here just during the summer. Just before I came, which was about 2004 or so, and it may have been a couple of years before that, Jim had been, and you'll please forgive me, James Bama was always Jim to me, and so I'll refer to him as Jim tonight. But Jim had been honored a few years before by the museum during the annual art exhibition. And at that time, he had announced that he intended to give his archival material to the museum. And that was really the impetus for Jim and I to start working together. Now, what followed in the next several years was a very special friendship. I was a young graduate student. I think I was 24 or 25 whenever I met Jim. And if you're any good at math at all, now you know how old I am. But I was a young graduate student, and I would go up to Wapiti, and I would spend about half of my day. I would spend the afternoons organizing the archival material. But I would go up each day and I would have lunch with Jim and Lynn, and we would sit at the lunch table. And I just remember these incredible conversations where we ultimately spent quite a lot of time together, and we talked about all things. We discussed politics and movies and sports, but most importantly, we talked about art. And what today I look back and I think, wow, that's such an interesting thing that, I was 20-something years old and Jim was more than 50 years my senior. And you would think, well, what do these two people have anything in common? But the truth was we developed this incredible friendship, both for me with both Jim and Lynn. But I remember one time Jim remarking something about the fact of us being friends and him being so much older than I am, and he said, well, we just love all the same things. And that was true. We were both big sports fans. We loved movies. But most of all, we had this thing in common of a passion for art. Before I did my graduate work in art history, I was, my undergraduate degree was in fine arts, and I was a painter. I was a abstract painter of all things. So you would again think, how did this abstract painting student and this photorealist or realist become friends with each other? And the truth was, for those who don't know, and no reason that you necessarily would, Jim was really a fan of all sorts of art, and particularly abstraction. And we talked a lot about abstract expressionism. And we talked just generally about art for hours and hours. It was at a moment in 2005 or so where Jim, his eyes had really begun to fail. And he was still painting, but he wasn't painting at the same pace or not as rapidly as he had before. And I think maybe in some ways it was just kind of perfect timing, because Jim had more time for someone like me. I think before he would have been working so diligently that might not have been the case, but it was just the right moment in his life that we were able to have this experience together. So much of what I will discuss today comes from my memories as much as anything, and my memories of those conversations and things that we talked about. I'm going to ask your forgiveness because in many ways I'm recalling things that go back 20 years, and I really haven't spent much time, certainly in the last 15 years or so, or the same amount of time thinking about these things. And so some things stick in my mind very clearly, and other things kind of come as I talk more and more about them. So I'll ask your forgiveness ahead of time. I did a few formal recordings of interviews with Jim during that period. Mostly during those interviews, we're talking about his work. We would look at paintings together, and I would say, okay, Jim, what's happening here? And he would talk about them. Those are less of the things that I remember. What I remember were conversations that we had more generally about art. And those weren't recorded. And there was no way to record them in that sense. They were just more, it was just friends talking about art more than something formal. And so I would like as much as I can to try to share those things with you. It also was during that I really began to understand more of the artist that Jim was most attracted to in his deeper but maybe less obvious influences. The painting that you see on the screen behind me, titled Bill Smith No. 1, this was the very first painting that I ever knew of by Jim Bama. It's owned by the National Cowboy Museum in Oklahoma City, which is where I'm from. And I took notice of this as a very young man, not because of the picture at all. It was totally because of the title, Bill Smith No. 1. My grandfather's name was Bill Smith, and so it instantly grabbed my attention and really became one of my favorite paintings when I was still 19, 20 years old. So I was familiar, and I knew of Jim Bama because of this introduction of this painting. So this was in many ways kind of the beginning, which predates even my coming to Cody. So I'll try to talk tonight for about an hour or so, and then I'll throw it open for questions. And I want to do that. I'll talk as long as I can until I either run out of slides or I run out of energy or breath, whichever one comes first. But I want to have plenty of time for Q&A, because I also realize that often I can share more through questions because I'm really trying to recall memories. I'll also hope that you'll excuse that I will leave out more of the biographical material about the artist. I know that many of you here are familiar with Jim Bama and his work, and know him since he lived here in Cody for so long. Now, most of us think of Jim Bama as the consummate realist, but I can tell you that his influences were quite varied, from abstract expressionism to pop art, and of course, photography. In fact, Bama fits right into the photorealism movement of the late 1960s that included artists like Richard Estes and Chuck Close, two examples that you see here on the screen. Or maybe the Californian Robert Bechtel, who was also working in the West. The movement is synonymous with a hyperrealism that incorporated an elevated detail in exchange for the more painterly qualities of individual painters. So if we think, what does that really mean to us? Previous to photorealism, you could really identify a painting by the painterly gestures that an artist made. It's like when you see a Van Gogh, you know instantly it's a Van Gogh. Well, the artists of the photorealism movement were really trying to wipe that out, and so that you just saw the image, if you would. And it's very closely related in many ways to the pop art movement, that it was just images of the moment, if you would. So an example would be this Robert Bechtel painting from 1975. You look at it and it helps you to recall 1975, and you could almost share this with someone and go, when was this? And you instantly know it's roughly the mid-1970s. Now, Jim, however, he rejected being called a photorealist, as he saw photography as a tool rather than trying to make his paintings look like photographs. His intention, he insisted, was not to recreate photos, but rather to render his subjects with photographic precision. Bama's use of photography began when he was a student at the Art Students League in New York. Frank Riley, Bama's principal instructor, introduced him to photography as a means of enriching his painting material. It was a technique he used throughout his career as an illustrator in New York, as he created magazine covers and advertisements. Here you see an example of a model there that Jim has captured that ultimately becomes the cover of this novel, a Nevada Jim Western. And you see a photo of Jim there working at his easel. And I have to say, he looks very Mad Men in this picture. Like it's just perfectly mid-century New York, I think, in that kind of moment of advertising that is so sort of coined of the Mad Men era. Jim and his wife Lynn moved to Wyoming in 1968. And it isn't possible to have a conversation about Jim Bama's photographs without considering his wife Lynn. And I really thought about this several times because I know Lynn is such a private person, and I thought about whether I bring this into my conversation, but I just thought you can't not include the influence and really partnership that you saw between Jim and Lynn. Now, Jim was always insistent that Lynn was the photographer and not him. And he was insistent that she was the one that had taught him enough about photography, including lighting and other things, to satisfy his needs for his painting. The difference was, for Jim, he always saw photography as a tool rather than the finished artwork, much like a photographer such as Lynn might. Lynn is a poet and photographer, and she worked much more in the vein, her photography was much more in the vein of artists like Edward or Brett Weston, very much a photographer focused on nature. But before coming west, Lynn had studied art history at NYU and was always a partner in Jim's artistic journey. And I would say that all of those conversations, or I shouldn't say all, but a good majority of them, were a three-way conversation between Jim and I and also Lynn. And we had such wonderful just fellowship about art that I recall, and Lynn was a key piece to that. So Jim, using a Hasselblad camera, he photographed people as he found them in the best available light. And the light that happens in the photograph and then ultimately makes its way into the painting was something that was really important. If you look at his archive of photographs, the light is really, you can tell that that's something he's really focusing on when he sets up the sessions with a subject. In this example of the photo turned painting of a woman named Faith Singsgood, Bama strove for a minimal background, and that was pretty common. And it focuses on the subject's physical features and also her apparel, what she's wearing. After evaluating the proofs, they were printed on contact sheets, and they look like this. You would get a contact sheet with 12 or so images that Jim would make his way through, and he was looking at each individual one. He would then select or decide on ones that he would use, and he wanted to enlarge, and ultimately those images became 11 by 14 printouts that he could see much larger, and are often the prints that you see like in the exhibition. And something that I hadn't thought much about till just in the last couple of weeks is the amount of time that Jim had to have spent evaluating the photos and how he was selecting really important things. Jim, through his training at the Art Students League, had this incredible understanding of light and shadow and composition. And he always talked about composition in his paintings. And he would say, here, this piece balances this part. And it just sort of dawned on me, and I don't know why I had never realized it before, that he was actually making those decisions not in the painting, but he was making a lot of those decisions in the selection of the photos. Things that were composed the way that he would want. Ultimately, referencing the photos, he then produces a freehand contour sketch on tracing paper. The image is further developed into a slightly shaded working drawing. And then Bama creates the work's color scheme by painting several small individual studies. And the studies would look something like this. The vast majority of the photographs that Jim took are in black and white. In fact, there's just a small minority that are in color. And that was very intentional because he didn't want the references to color. He wanted to come up with the color scheme from his own imagination, from his own mind. And it would also allow him to create the painting that he wanted. And the color became very important. The selection of color became very important. And I think this is a great example because, let me turn to the next. This is a study for what ultimately becomes this painting. And if just take a look at the painting for just a moment, and then I want to go back. Can you imagine if any of these other choices, these other options had been the background? I remember talking about this with Jim, and he was very drawn to this background that had the word cigar. Because going back to the old idea of the cigar store, Indian objects. But I can't even imagine the painting any other way than what it ultimately ended up being, which is the one, the lower one there. But he would create those different studies so that he could select the color scheme that best fit, what he thought best fit the picture. He disregarded the tonal scale of film and paper and uses the intensity of light source to control his depiction of shadows. Bama selected an appropriate background for his subjects from other photographs, oftentimes. And then, of course, this is the finished work that is in the collection at the museum here in Cody, as well as you can see the sketches in the exhibition as well. Now, the photographs essentially divide into two categories. One are what Jim referred to as grab shots, like the ones that you see here. This contact sheet, of course, has a dozen pictures, and these were things that he was just shooting. They're not formal sittings, but they're just things he was grabbing, things he was interested in as he was at a rodeo or at a powwow or something. And Jim once said, and I quote, "Some of the best paintings that I've done are from grab shots, where people didn't even know I was taking their picture. They get into attitudes that I can't pose them in. But grab shots sometimes work great, just great," end quote. And a single grab shot could become a finished painting like this. And this is a painting that's actually at the Denver Art Museum in their collection, and one I got to know quite well. And I always knew the image where the original image had come from. And this was just a grab shot that Jim saw a young man in Hardin, Montana at Crow Fair activities. And if things are going really good and you're like living right and you have a really great day, you can even get two paintings on a single contact sheet, which you see right here. It's kind of amazing, in a series of 12 grab shots ultimately becomes two wonderful paintings, both the young Plains Indian and then Portrait of a Sioux, which you see a detail of from 1979. Then the second category, I would say, are the more formal sessions. Jim often met people at events, or he met them around town, and he would ask them if he could take their photos, if they would do a photo session. And it usually went something along the lines of, he would introduce himself, he would say he was an artist, and he would say, "I like the way you look. Can I take your photograph?" Now, one of the interesting things is there's a photo there of a Hasselblad camera, and this isn't the camera he took, but it's just a random Hasselblad. But I included it because there's something really interesting about this. The Hasselblad camera, unlike many cameras which you raise up to your face and take photographs, the Hasselblad you look down into. And what makes that interesting is it allowed Jim, who was very gregarious and very outgoing, to look down, to communicate with his sitter as he was looking into the camera. So it becomes much less, what would I say, intimidating in the sense, or less formal. Just think of the realities of that to have an artist standing there taking your picture versus someone who's just standing there talking to you and then just clicks the camera whenever they have it right. It really developed this dialogue during the sessions, and it's what happens during these sessions can be really complex. It might be awkward because the sitter is uncomfortable, or it could be very exciting because you have someone who is really rather enjoying the process of having their photograph taken. It's just one of the things that you can expect because of the human dimension, that there's actually a relationship that is happening between the photographer and the sitter. Now, in the libraries, ultimately what came into the library's collection is approximately 50,000 negatives. and there's a cross-section of people. As Jim stated, and I quote, "There's a story in every one of these paintings because these are real people, today's people," unquote. And Bama was drawn to people of all ranges of background, social, economic, race. I don't think that was by accident. An aspect that I think has been overlooked, and maybe not been overlooked, but hasn't really been discussed, is the artist's egalitarian approach to his subjects. Now, while not outwardly evident, I propose that Jim's early life and his experiences really shaped this approach. Jim grew up in Manhattan's Washington Heights neighborhood, just north of Harlem. And the Washington Heights neighborhood of Jim Bama's youth was a diverse mixture of ethnic groups. And the tensions between Irish Catholic and Eastern European Jews could be intense. While never himself practicing the religious faith, Jim was ethnically Jewish, and certainly when he was a young man would have been identified as such when he was a teenager or something. But also, Bama was accepted into the prestigious High School of Music and Art, which was an even more ethnically diverse environment, as it also included many Black and Latino students. Jim told a reporter in 1980, he said, and I quote, how I ever got out of New York and out here, I'll never know. Not with my heritage and origins," unquote. I propose that his early experiences, coupled with his outsider manner, and I say his outsider manner because he was, by all measure, a New Yorker in Northwest Wyoming. Okay, but those were all part of what led to this democratic, what I would say it was a democratic approach to the people that he took photographs of and ultimately painted. And this was something that Jim was, what I'm trying to say is this was something that Jim was sensitive to, and that would have come from his early experiences. Now, one of the examples of the artist's readiness and attentiveness to such issues came in 1974 when he attended a Native American basketball tournament in Denver. And this is one of the works that ultimately comes out of this series. Knowing that he would find interesting subjects for his portraits among the participants, Bama prepared a photography location in a small alley near the sports venue. During the weekend, the artist experienced his most fruitful photography session to date. Bama found young Indians he met at the tournament to be complex subjects, worthy of his artistic efforts. Bama painted the young men he photographed in Denver against a contemporary backdrop, thereby avoiding stereotypical Indian motifs. Bama stated, and I quote, "I was uninhibited by what other people had done with the traditional Indian. I saw this as an opportunity to place them in a contemporary setting," unquote. In subsequent years, Bama painted a series of portraits of young subjects he found in Denver. Now, one of the things that makes this so interesting of him finding these young men at this moment in the mid-1970s is that it coincides directly with the rise of the American Indian movement. And Jim was drawn to them because he saw them as this really kind of defiant, that they had a defiant look to them, and they were young and they had a different energy to them, in this sort of idea that they weren't going to stand for being treated the way they had in the past. These works mark what I consider to be the pinnacle of his artistic development, and Bama felt they were his greatest and most successful artistic statements. Now, the artist's integration of realism and abstraction set him apart from many of his realist peers. Now, Bama does not paint in the abstract expressionist sense of Jackson Pollock, but instead searches for abstraction as it appears in life. While traveling around Wyoming and Montana, Bama noticed the abstract beauty of old walls, which he began to photograph for future reference. Although he created an archive of such material for years, he had no specific use in mind. But he found the backdrops perfect for his portraits of contemporary Native Americans. The abstract background used in A Young Okalala Sioux, for example, belongs to a building from Fromberg, Montana, an almost deserted town between Cody and Billings. This was Bama's first significant integration of abstract art with realism. Bama's abstract backgrounds were inspired by the photographer Aaron Siskind. And Siskind often directed his camera at peeling walls. Siskind was a key member of the abstract expressionist movement in New York and its sole photographer. Siskind had photographed a series called Harlem Document, which was an early essay of his work, which ironically happened to be near where Bama was from, where he had lived and attended school. In the early 1940s, after Siskind befriended abstract expressionists such as Franz Klein, Barnett Newman, Adolf Gottlieb, and Mark Rothko, his work shifted to abstraction. Siskind exhibited his photographs at the Charles Egan Gallery, which specialized in abstract expressionism. It was really, he was the only photographer that was really part of the abstract expressionist club, if you will, in that way. During the 1950s, Siskind's primary subjects were urban facades containing partial signs, graffiti, peeling posters, and isolated figures, and the stone walls of Martha's Vineyard. Here you see an example of Aaron Siskind there from a photo he took in 1959, and then the other one is the one on the right, my right, is a photo that Jim Bama took of a wall. The integration would ultimately look something like this. He would use the wall with one of the, would ultimately become the backdrop for one of his paintings. And even further, here you see the photograph of the background. You see the photograph of the subject of the painting, and then the two of them together. And you see them in black and white, and ultimately in the painting it has the vivid color. And I just, as I was putting this presentation together, another thing that I kind of realized that dawned on me, and it's been really interesting to go back to this material 15 years later, and you realize things that you never thought of before. I guess you're just so close to it at one moment, and you step back for 15 years and you come back. And I was putting it together in this presentation, and I realized it's a form of collage, in a sense, that he's taking, you know, this image from here and this image from here, and then he's adding his own color, and it all just kind of comes together in this collage effect, if you will. Another example of how photographs played into this dynamic is a Sioux Indian wearing ribbon shirt that you see right here. And again, you see this combination of the abstract wall with the portrait that he had taken and how it comes together. Now, Jim always talked about the peeling wall and how he liked the L and the O, and what it reminded him of was Robert Indiana's iconic pop art image of love, which he did in 1964. So you get a sense of these influences that you wouldn't normally think of when you're looking at such a realist. That he was picking all of these things up from really art history, but of popular culture and what was happening in the world at the time, but also in the art world, as you can see. I recall Jim once commenting that he was influenced more by photographers than painters. And I think that may well have been the case. The most obvious in one of the few photographers that Jim is on record talking about is Edward S. Curtis. Curtis's monumental series, The North American Indian, which he worked on from 1907 until 1930, contains thousands of images, and for the most part, they were portraits. And I think it's important to keep in mind that when Jim and Lynn came to Wyoming in 1968, that a lot of the artists that we think of as sort of traditionally in the Western art canon, people like Curtis or either Remington and Russell, those were, most of that material was new to Jim and sort of would have been a revelation of sorts. And so he really, as he started to do his own work and find really interesting people, he was also finding artists that had done work that he found interesting. Here you see a few of the portraits by Curtis. Now, how the influence might have taken shape, it might have looked a little something like this, I would propose. The two portraits on the left by Curtis are of a gentleman named Medicine Crow. Medicine Crow fought beside the U.S. Army against tribal enemies during the Great Sioux War of 1876. And he later served his people as a reservation chief until his death in 1920. While serving as chief, Medicine Crow traveled to Washington, D.C. numerous times on behalf of the Crow people and was presented with a Peace Medal by President Woodrow Wilson. Bama would later paint Medicine Crow's son, who you see here. His name is Chester Medicine Crow. And in the painting that Jim, in the photograph in the ultimate painting, you see Chester wearing his father's peace medal. The subject isn't the only connection with Curtis. As you can see, the soft background in the painting really recalls this soft background that you see in the formal portrait that is done by Curtis. And I would pose that part of that is to give an ambiguity to time, right? So in the Bama photograph and painting, if we showed you an image and I said to you, what is the date of this? You wouldn't necessarily know. You might guess 1970s, but you might also guess 1870s, okay? It's divorced from that concept that I talked about in the very beginning with Robert Bechtel of the family there at the Grand Canyon. That work, you would say that's the mid-1970s. In a work like this, time is really ambiguous, and part of that is by taking out the details of the background. A photographer that I don't think Jim ever was recorded talking about or ever talked about in any formal way, but he and I talked about repeatedly and talked about for hours was Richard Avedon. And Richard Avedon was an influential American fashion and portrait photographer that worked for magazines like Harper's Bazaar, Vogue, or Elle. Avedon had been born in New York City to a Jewish family like Jim, and was only about 3 years older than Jim. Now, from 1979 until 1985, the Amon Carter Museum had commissioned Avedon to photograph the American West. This series, titled In the American West, that was finished in 1985, inspired a spirited discussion regarding the nature of portraiture and methods of interpreting the modern West. Some saw the series as celebrating the uncelebrated, while others criticized it for depicting the West underbelly. One of the things that Avedon did was photograph all his subjects against white backgrounds with no sign of the landscape. One might note, essentially taking the West out of the image, taking the land itself out of the image. And the entire series by Avedon is like this. It reminded me, much like Jim's photos, it focuses on the person and simply what they're conveying with their attire. And here is one example I thought was related. This is a photograph of Rose Plentygood. But I want to take back to this slide and sort of state that again, that by taking the background out and only having this white background, if you'll notice, what you focus on is you really focus on the person's face, their posture, and what they're wearing. The center image was one that I always thought was really compelling. This is done, as I said, between 1979 and 1985. The image in the center, the Native American man who's wearing kind of the denim shirt, it really sort of takes time out of it. That could be at sort of any moment, in something that I found really compelling. Now, if or how Avedon directly influenced or affected Jim's work, I can't really say. I'm not sure that it did. But they were certainly working along similar lines. Jim was totally conscious of what Avedon was doing, and I remember us discussing Avedon's series in great detail, really looking at the individual images and talking about this one and that one, and how wonderful they were. I also can't help but think that a work like this one, titled Northern Plains Indian, which actually precedes the release of Avedon's series by a year. So this came out, this painting was done by Jim in 1984. Avedon's series comes out in 85. They were certainly tapping into a similar zeitgeist at the moment of people and sort of removing this background, which is so much of what we think of in the Western art vernacular. Bama's work with a soft white background seems to increase in the mid-1980s and moving forward from then on. In paintings previous to that, he oftentimes, you see full backgrounds of landscapes. Then he goes through where he's pulling photographs from different backgrounds and putting them together in that kind of collage type. And then later, from this period going forward, he does a lot of works that have sort of no background. They're either like this soft white or a light cream to them. which I found it could be totally coincidental, but it is something really interesting that they both were tapping into. And now I want to leave you with a couple of quotes from Jim that I think are at the center of his approach. The first one is, and I quote, "The whole concept of what I do starts with the photograph and the model," which gets to this really important aspect there of the model. He also stated, and I quote, "I generally paint people who are not affluent, people that perhaps have had a little more of a struggle in life. Successful people are not nearly as interesting as people that are fighting the battle of life," end quote. The importance of people, and one of the things that when you look at the photographs in the exhibition that really rings home, and it kept coming into my mind as I went through the exhibition, is it was really about people that drew Jim, first and foremost. It was really finding these interesting people that were telling this story in the way that they looked, in their posture, and all these things, and allowed Jim to make his own statement about life. Thank you. And I'm happy to take some questions. Karen?
Actually, I have 2 questions.
Only one?
2 to start. The
Yeah.
first is about the more staged photographs. When he was working with models, did he, I noticed the ribbon shirt reappear several times. Did he have the ribbon shirt with him or other favorite items that models could choose from? That's my first question.
Yeah.
And also, given his close relationship so evident through the photographs, and Lynn might be able to help me with this one. What was his style of communication like after a photography session or art making session? Did he stay in good touch with folks? Did he write letters?
Yeah. Let me try to answer the first question. Karen was asking about, she saw a repetition of like the ribbon shirt, and if essentially there were props involved in things. As I understand it, and pouring through those images a long time ago, as I understood it, most times Jim would sort of say, I want to do a whole photo shoot with you, bring your stuff. Yeah. Basically, bring what you want to wear, bring your saddle, bring your gun, whatever it is that you would want to be photographed with. It really wasn't a situation where Jim had props that he would give to them. Now, in particular, the ribbon shirts are a really interesting story, because the ribbon shirts, I remember Jim talking about how they had become, like, there had been a resurgence of men wearing ribbon shirts at the time, and they were more of a traditional attire that goes back to the reservation period. But they started wearing them again in kind of the late 70s. I learned today from Susan that during one of the interviews they did with one of the models that is in, I can't remember if it is.
Rick Williams is his name.
Is it? Is it this one? Okay, so Susan and Ashley did oral history with an interview with this person, Rick Williams, and he told them that I think it was his sister had worked with Jim to kind of coordinate everything, and that she had told them what to wear. And I didn't recall Jim ever telling me that piece of it, which made me kind of wonder, and I don't know, Lynn would probably know this, but made me kind of wonder if Jim knew that she had said, hey, wear this. But as a visual, Jim was really taken with this from a conceptual idea, which I think is really interesting. Oh, sorry.
I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
I'm far less informed than my fiance on this, so I was wondering if you could, one, talk a little bit about what you were getting to Cody, of all places.
Right.
And then this question, following up on that, is it's probably hard to talk about the influence of this place on his work, especially with dealing with someone who does a lot of abstraction, not place-based art. But I wonder if you have any insight to share about what Cody, why Cody for Jim, and then what impact Cody had.
Yeah. So the beginnings of why Jim and Lynn came here is that they visited an artist friend named Bob Myers in 1966. And I don't know exactly how Jim knew Bob Myers, but he was an artist, and they visited him out at his ranch, which was out on the South Fork, and that was the very first beginnings. But they had discussed leaving Manhattan, leaving New York, and I think it was at a moment in Jim's life where he essentially makes a career change of sorts, in that he was certainly an artist, but he was doing illustration, he was doing book and magazine covers and all these things, and he saw the opening to make a shift to be a fine artist, someone who was a painter, and wasn't doing things on commission, but he could paint what he wanted to paint and what he found interesting. And so they came out in '66 and made the move by '68 to come out here. And I think, the attraction must have been the open spaces, the landscape. Getting out of Manhattan was certainly a reason. I was thinking about it today, and I can't imagine what Cody was like in 1966, and to people from Manhattan coming out here. I mean, it must have been like landing on the moon for two New Yorkers. But I think they were probably drawn to a place that they could work, and certainly for Jim, when he first came out, for a couple of years, he was still doing illustration work, commissions, and he was doing that during the day. At night, he would do his own work, and he did enough paintings to where he had a show, and he had an exhibit in New York, which I always found really interesting. That when he had enough work, he only thought about going back to New York to do a gallery exhibition, and the show went well. He sold everything, and that was the route from that day forward. He said, I'm just going to be a painter. In a way, I think once he moved here, I mean, Cody, in a roundabout way, becomes the subject. I mean, it becomes the whole sort of, the whole picture, if you will. So it influences him in all of his subjects. As I mentioned, he also found different, I think, artistic stimulus and things that we look at today and go, those are really obvious. And what I was talking about with maybe more of the pop art and the abstract expressionists, those are things that he brought with him. He brought with him from New York, and they seep into the Western subjects. And so I've always been a big believer that we can't think of Jim in just the Western lineage or just in the Western vernacular, that his place is really more in this American art story. So it influenced him greatly because he saw different artists and because he focused on people and the visual, that it all comes into his work. There's a line right here. All three of you have a question, so we will start in the back.
Did you talk to you any about the things he was wanting to do that he knew he wasn't going to get to?
Sure. I mean, there were, as I said, almost 50,000 images in the archive. Of course, he was screening through them to find the best, and there was no way he could have ever got to all the things he wanted to do. As I mentioned in the talk, at the moment that I sort of arrived in his life, his eyes were failing, and he wasn't able to finish paintings. And I remember kind of asking him about it one day, and he had such a great attitude about it. I know it was difficult, but he had a great attitude about it, and he said, "I think I've done enough." You know, he was comfortable in whatever artistic legacy he was leaving. He just, to me, as I remember, he felt very comfortable in that. There's a quote, I think, in the catalog that says something about I did what I did, and I'll let the curators and collectors and everyone else sort it out. And I think he felt very confident in that. Yeah. It's a question right here. I thought you had your hand up. You had? Okay.
I thought there was something.
Yeah.
No, like in this pair of the photograph and the painting,
Mhm.
and a couple of others as well, I'm interested in how the framing of the photograph is kind of like more what you'd expect, and in the painting, he's put a lot of space above the subject's head.
Yeah. Yeah, they're really interesting. Really interesting comment. She, and I'm just going to repeat it so that everyone hears it. She was commenting on how in the photograph, the framing, you see the subject takes up the majority of the composition, that his head is up close to the top of the photograph. And then ultimately in the painting, he's further down in the composition, and there's all this space between. Jim was always thinking about composition, and as I mentioned, Jim was a compositional master. I mean, he understood composition like probably no artist I've ever found that understood it the way he did, and he knew what worked on the page in a way, and I would say a lot of the decisions he made in something like this would have been informed by his years as an illustrator. So oftentimes in illustrations, you would have a lot of space because the text was going to go in there, okay? But Jim would have learned, because he would have seen it ultimately printed with the text above, but he saw the painting without the text. And so he would have been informed by those kind of things in the compositions. Here, I think the way he's pulled the figure down and he's given that space, really, to me, it allows the figure to breathe, where the photograph is really kind of more intense in a sense. And I don't know why he made that decision, but that's how I read it for me. I also find in this image the sort of pink and yellow stripes, vertical stripes that go down, are asymmetrical, and is a really nice way of composing the figure directly in the center of the painting. But he balances that by doing something that is asymmetrical in these small lines that come down. So Jim was always sort of thinking about those things and making adjustments. Something that I realized as I was looking at this painting. If I go back, I was looking at this a couple of days ago, and Jim often talked about, I made this change with the figure for compositional reasons, and I made that change. And I started looking at this, and I go, oh man, he didn't change anything. Like he changed almost nothing in this. And I noticed a couple of others are really close to the photograph. And I realized that he was doing so much selecting and editing by looking at the photos, that by the time he he had scanned through 3 or 4 images of this. He knew this was the one that had the composition he wanted. And then he could take it and do what he wanted with it. Yeah.
It seems as if Bama's choice of models really changed over the course of his artistic career. Like at the beginning, he was interested in old timers, and then and most of his early photos too were very posed, and I think some of the graph shots came later. And I just wonder if that's something that he talked about at all with you, and how he made that transition.
Yeah. The short answer is no, not that I recall. Susan and I had lunch today, and she mentioned this, and I thought it was really interesting because it wasn't something I ever thought about. But as during lunch we started thinking about that, and I also saw it in the book, in the publication. You talk about bring out the part where as Jim gets older, he starts to be drawn to younger people. And I find that, so when he was younger, maybe in his 40s and 50s, he was drawn to these really wrinkly old characters. As he got older himself, he is drawn toward these younger people. He never said anything about it, but Jim was so young at heart. He really was, and he had incredible energy. And I can't help but think there was something as he aged that he became even more attracted to people who were younger. And in part maybe why in 2005 a 25-year-old guy came into his life and became friends. I don't know. You know, it's hard to sort of speculate. Any other questions? John.
I'm just wondering, really naive for Jim's painting. I saw some sketches, I think they were like World War II airplanes, and I've seen some of Chinese figures. Could you correlate what he did when? Was the Chinese before this, after this? What he did?
Yeah, I can try. John was mentioning that he had seen some images that Jim had done of World War II planes and things, and then some Chinese subjects. The World War II planes would have been while he was illustrating, and I would assume they probably were a commission that a company or somebody he was doing, or there was a story and they said this is what we need, and he would create illustrations for that. The Chinese series is quite different. He made a trip to China, and I can't remember the year exactly, but he made a trip to China after he had sort of given up illustration and was painting. And he did the same thing. He took tons of photographs. And there are lots of photos of China. And he did an entire series. And I don't know how many, but dozens of subjects there were of China, including one of Tiananmen Square that has a big graphic in the back in Chinese. And I want to say it was like within weeks of the, and someone who knows history a little better than me about this thing of the protest in Tiananmen Square. He was there just right before that, I think, and really compelling works. And now I don't know how popular they were. They might have been on the market, might have been really popular, but are really kind of a diversion from his Western subjects. But I think it also speaks to, in some ways, Jim's depiction of Western subjects was coincidental. He was painting people of the West because he was here in Cody. If he would have lived somewhere else, he would have been painting the people that were there. He makes a comment about that if he would have been on the Eastern Seaboard, he would have been painting wrinkly old fishermen. or something. And so I think the Chinese series is certainly in that vein, but really compelling works too. Okay, thank you all. Oh, one last, okay.
Yeah, your comment on the people that he painted. A lot of the people, they walk the streets of town.
Yeah.
Because I was Jim's neighbor,
Yeah.
and I grew up with him.
Yeah.
You know, and that's, he painted the people that live around here.
Yeah, certainly the comment from the gentleman is that Jim painted the people who were here. And it's if you're interested in people and painting portraits and people that were interesting, I mean, what a gold mine. He really stepped into a gold mine and found some interesting people. And I think, too, someone from Jim who, like Jim, who was born and raised New Yorker, to come out and see the West with like these fresh eyes. And the people that Jim was drawn to would have been different than any other artist necessarily would have been drawn to. In many ways, he was drawn to people and characters who he just saw, and in his like aesthetic impulse said, "Oh man, I like the way that guy looks, and that would make a great portrait." They were people that ultimately become this person, you know, by a name, and Jim knew them by name, and he sort of, anytime a photo or a painting would come up, he would instantly say, "Oh, that's this person." He knew them by name, and they were individuals to him, right? They were people. They were people he knew, he had befriended, and I think that was something he was drawn to and was really compelling. One last one? Anyone? No takers? Okay, thank you all so much.